Hi, I'm Rihanna Dillon, and you're listening to another seriously great podcast from BBC Radio 4.
We've complained to the police about the police and nothing's been done. We've complained to magistrates about magistrates and nothing's been done. We've complained to judges about judges and nothing's been done. Now it's time to do something ourselves.
The British Black Panthers, taking their name from the American Black Panther Party, founded in 1966 in Oakland, California.
I am a revolutionary.
Inspired by its radical ideas.
That's what the Panthers are doing. That's what the Panthers are doing all over the world.
But rooted very much in Britain. The experiences of growing up here.
That's the essence of black people's experience in Britain.
You have to organize yourself politically.
Their story isn't widely known, being very nearly written out of history.
Let my people go. Black people.
The British Black Panther movement came together during the political turmoil of 1968.
Let my people go.
The year Martin Luther King was assassinated,
Dr. King.
radicalizing black politics around the world.
Face forth with force if necessary.
Black power. Talking about children.
The year when Enoch Powell delivered his infamous Rivers of Blood speech.
In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
The British Panthers marched, debated, and argued.
Let my people go. We have become the own shepherds of our destiny as from today.
They published, taught, set up Saturday schools, worked from a headquarters financed by the proceeds of the Booker Prize.
I'm actually going to give half the prize to the London-based Black Panther movement.
Campaigned for better housing and against new immigration laws and the threat of repatriation.
All we say is that we've got enough immigrants into the country and that no more should be allowed in.
They policed the police. They took on the British justice system and won.
The Mangrove 9 trial was to be one of the longest in British legal history.
And they marched under the sign of their American counterparts, the Black Panther.
It was at last, people are standing up.
Listen here.
For us.
I'm totally together.
Let's do something about it. Let's create a Black Panther movement in Britain.
We're not African Americans. At this point, we're still growing up, if you like, politically. At this point, we're still fighting to identify our own narrative as to who we are, what we are in a place that's saying, go home.
I started to hear about the Panthers in Britain. These were British people. And the roles and the justice and the things that they were talking about was things I could identify with. I knew that I wanted to somehow connect with them.
You have to say, my power is not only the power to defend myself.
Now what they do in the court is not so much...
It seemed quite exclusive.
The black population on the other side.
It seemed quite almost superstar.
Special branch and police photographers were on the march right from the beginning.
If you knew someone that was in the Panthers, like who do you know? In the same way that it might have been a really famous musician.
I think what's most interesting about, I guess, the spirit of this generation is it's not seeking permission.
What our objective is today, what is going to continue to be, is a concerted, determined...
The Panthers gave us the confidence to be able to stand up and say what we need to say.
Fire for fire and blood for blood. You know, that was it.
Together.
The Black Panthers seem like part of American history. Who knew they were part of our story too? I'm Kehinde Andrews, professor and author who co-founded the first Black Studies degree in Europe at Birmingham City University. I grew up with the bookshops and Saturday schools that were part of the community tradition passed from the Panther generation of the late 60s and 70s to the present. The British Panthers were about ideas, not guns. Not victims of racism, but its combatants. Pride in who you are. These were the years when Black Power ignited in Britain and forever changed how we think and talk about race in this country.
I actually don't remember a time when Black American culture wasn't present. I grew up with that culture as much as I grew up with Caribbean culture. It was sort of ever present, you know, the post-civil rights era Black Power imagery, along with the Rastafarianism that was coming out of Jamaica at the same time, sort of remade Black British identity.
Writer and rapper Akala.
One of the great ironies of racism is if you make whiteness the definitive boundary upon which a person's right to own other human beings and to brutalize other human beings is defined. Ironically, you open up the way for blackness to be the exact opposite of that. It became resistance to slavery. And that's not to say that black people are paragons of moral excellence. It's to say that the idea of blackness then becomes symbolic of freedom and of the best of humanity and not the worst of it.
Poet Benjamin Zephaniah.
Black Power. It's a very interesting question, that, because I wrote a poem once, many years ago. One of the lines in it was, "So in my darkest hour, when I move with the tide, I do not need black power because I have black pride." I guess what I was trying to say was, actually power in itself is not a great thing. But in the context of there are these people that have power over us, and we want to have the power to have a say in our destiny as a people, as black people. That's how I interpreted it.
Black power.
The words black and power together were terrifying to America. Terrifying today. People don't even want to say black. I mean, we've ameliorated the term so it's not so offensive to African American, which is, you know, I don't even know what that means exactly.
Elaine Brown was chair of the American Black Panther Party.
So the word black power, the term really did have a great effect not only on black people but also on white people. It terrified a lot of white America. And it emboldened a lot of black America.
The force of black power hit Britain in 1967 when Stokely Carmichael, a high-profile supporter of the American Panthers, came to speak.
Stokely Carmichael, the most militant of the American Negro leaders, has paid his first and almost certainly his last visit to England.
We have never lynched a white man. We have never burnt their churches. We have never bombed their houses. We have never beat them in the streets. I wish we could say the same for white people around the world. Our history demonstrates...
Carmichael, who later became Kwame Ture, addressed a huge congress held at the Camden Rand House in London, The Dialectics of Liberation. I listened to Stokely's words, cutting like a switchblade, wrote the African-American radical Angela Davis.
We're now being shot down like dogs in the streets by white racist policemen. We can no longer accept this oppression without retribution.
The conference featured other alternative thinkers of the day.
The only culture that exists,
the psychiatrist R.D. Laing,
is the black culture.
The philosopher Herbert Marcuse,
I came today thinking
Beat Generation writers William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg.
Psychopolitical nature. The hippies are victims of Western mechanization, and we can never regard them as revolutionaries. Therefore, as far as black power is concerned, we cannot take them serious.
Farouk Dondi was a member of the British Black Panther movement's central core.
There were several speakers from the West Indies, from America. There was Stokely Carmichael. There was C.L.R. James, who was a Trinidadian philosopher, whom I actually accompanied to the conference.
Restrictive practices of real estate agents. We're talking now about the United States, but I think you can apply a little of it to London.
Stokely Carmichael was a rebel rouser. He was a rabble rouser and a rebel rouser, saying that when I encounter injustice, I will fight back.
Our history demonstrates that the reward for trying to peacefully coexist has been the physical and psychological murder of our peoples.
It was an inspiring moment to make people pause and think, I do suffer injustice, how shall I fight back? That there is, in an entire generation, the seed of resistance.
What the Indians should have done when they were fighting for their independence, instead of going through non-violence, they should have invited all of the English to eat prepared them a fine meal, and then when they went to sleep, just... You would have had your independence overnight. Thank you very much.
Stokely raised the alarm.
Stokely Carmichael's brand of nationalism, black power...
His speeches were deemed so incendiary, he was banned from re-entering Britain by then Home Secretary Roy Jenkins.
In 9 days, he gave the black community in this country publicity, encouragement, and a kind of cohesion. The Home Secretary, however, has announced that his presence here...
I know. Maybe the next time you come back.
You think the British government...
Historian Robin Bunce.
Roy Jenkins was looking across the Atlantic. He was looking at what was going on in America.
The rest of the world calls this a riot. Black people call it a rebellion. To the black man, the tanks holding down Detroit belonged to an occupying power.
They were very concerned about the prospect of widespread rioting in the UK, and there was even some talk that mainland Britain would become balkanised.
He believes violence achieved quicker and more positive results.
Or become much like Ulster was at the time, riven between violent factional tension because of the Black Power movement. So that was the kind of feeling at the top of the state at the time.
The chairman of the Race Relations Board is Mark Bonham Carter.
Well, let me first say one thing in general about black power, which is, whatever you may think of black power, it's extremely dangerous to make comparisons between the United States and this country. Racial politics in this country have never been part of the political tradition.
They don't mind. You can say whatever you want to say, as radical as you want to sound to a white audience. If you say the same thing to a black audience, they get upset,
Yeah.
Because with a white audience, it's all intellectual debate, but with a black audience, it's revolutionary talk. We're about ready anytime you are, so.
Right.
By the time Stokely Carmichael came to Britain in '67, the Black Panthers were already on the rise in America, though nothing like the movement they'd become. Founded in Oakland, California, by Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was a radical alternative to the civil rights movement. It initiated its official 10-point program.
It says we're going to draw up a basic platform that black people can read. We want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our black community. Full employment for our people. Decent housing fit for shelter of human beings.
Co-founder of the Black Panther Party, Bobby Seale.
When we was writing the 10-point platform program, I was not trying to write some dissertative piece, I'm trying to communicate with the people in the grassroots community. So in the 10-point platform program, just get to the point, okay?
We want an immediate end to police brutality and murder of black people. This is very, very important.
A surge in American Panther membership followed the assassination of Martin Luther King in Memphis in April 1968. The beacon of non-violence being gunned down was too much for many to bear.
Hands up high. Give your left arm high.
An insurgency spread across America.
First one drops their hand, dead man.
So, what did it mean to be in the Black Panther Party? You sold Black Panther Party newspapers, you know what I mean? We went to rallies. We mandated our first little programs that we was putting together. The first little breakfast program we was putting together at St. Augustine's Church and stuff like this here. But the party was not a big organization. Not until after Dr. Martin Luther King was killed. I moved from 400 members to 5,000 members in 49 chapters and branches throughout the United States of America.
The question wasn't civil rights, the question was human rights, but it got boiled down into a conversation about black and white children running up a mountainside, holding hands, what have you. Dr. King was really a revolutionary, and by 1967, only a year after the formation of the Black Panther Party, he asked the question, where do we go from here? And that we had to do something more. And so we heightened the contradictions, and we had new things to deal with, and we had new analyses to make.
Other Black Panther organizations sprang up outside the USA, Australia, India, Israel. But the British Panthers were the first. Neil Kenlock was the British Panthers photographer.
Now one day I went to a club in Stratton. In those days you have to wear suit and tie. So my friend and I put on our suit and tie, went to the entrance of the club, and they said, well, I'm sorry, the club is full today. you can't come in. Why don't you come back next week? Following week, we put our suits on, our tie, clean our shoes, arrived there again. And they said, well, sorry, you can't come in. Then we said, well, why? You know, we're well dressed. Last week you told us that we can't come in. I'm not going to go. I'm going to stay here. So the manager said, we will call the police if you don't go. I said, call the police.
Do you remember the days of slavery?
I can remember when I had my first racist attack. Somebody slapped me in the back of my head with a brick and said, go home, you black bastard. And I remember going home and saying to Mum, I don't understand it, Mum. Okay, I'm black. I was going home anyway. You know, that's what I thought. And my mum explained to me that some people don't like us. But it doesn't matter because we're going to die and go to heaven.
Police arrived and the police officer said to us, look, they don't want your type here. You should go home. No, we're not going to go home. Right? He said, look, I'm going to arrest you if you don't go. So that was like a wake-up call. So one day, after that, maybe about 2-3 weeks, I went down to Brixton Market and they were giving out leaflets. And it was the Black Panthers.
There was this concept of black power that somehow I just knew I was connected with. And as a kid, I'm trying to work all this stuff out. My mother's telling me not to think about this stuff. She's trying to tell me to go to church and be a good Christian. But I understood that black people all over the world were suffering injustice, and there was these people calling themselves the Panthers, the Black Panthers.
I believe that why that attack was
These were British people.
launched and why
I knew that I wanted to somehow connect with them.
Proportion. And that experience in my terms.
And in the leaflet it said, if you believe that you've been discriminated against, come to our meeting.
And generally repressive.
So I arrived at the meeting. They said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a photographer. I take photographs of the community. And they said, great, we haven't got a photographer, so you are now our official photographer. And that's how I joined the Black Panthers.
The Americans called themselves the Black Panther Party, but it wasn't something that one could duplicate precisely in Britain. In Britain, to start with, we were immigrants. We were historically prescient enough to call it the Black Panther movement.
The British Black Panthers began in London in 1968 as a small secretive group hoping to be the vanguard of the rebellion. Members would be required to swear an oath of allegiance. We members of the Black Panther movement acknowledge it to be a militant movement, the vanguard, spearhead of the Black Power revolution. It is our duty to acquaint ourselves with the skills that will bring true independence, justice and freedom to our people. The initial rules of membership included, quote, basic karate, practice and principle, judo, practice, intelligence work, weaponry, military training.
So the black man has come to realize that the only way to fight this international white power...
A key figure in its foundation was Obi Egbuna, a Nigerian playwright and Hyde Park rebel who'd shared a platform with Stokely Carmichael at the Camden Townhouse a year earlier.
Where's Stokely Carmichael's party?
All men are born free. It is men who make slaves of other men, opened his 1967 manifesto, Black Power in Britain, invoking Rousseau. There is no such thing as the abolition of slavehood. You can only talk about the destruction of masterhood. Egbuna was arrested and charged only months after the Panthers began for his pamphlet, What to Do If Cops Lay Their Hands on a Black Man at the Speaker's Corner. There was a change in tone and tactics. Others began to take prominent roles in the movement.
It's something that everybody appearing in the court should really...
Althea Jones-LeCointe, a Trinidadian-born research scientist, became a de facto leader.
They have no interest in those defendants. They have no interest in the truth.
And Darcus Howe, also born in Trinidad, who had studied law.
The Black Panther movement, we were young, to use a Caribbean metaphor. We were hot, full of zest and energy, and we didn't want to hear anybody older than 35, and anybody who was not taking risks on the street in political confrontation.
I was a member of the Brixton branch of the Black Panther movement. We had branches in West London, North London and South London. I was in the Black Panthers, South London.
Dub poet Linton Kwesi Johnson came up through the Panthers youth section.
And our leader was a remarkable woman called Althea Jones-LeCointe. In those days, she was doing a PhD in biochemistry.
That's the essence of black people's experience in Britain. That since we've come here, we've suffered a long train of abuses by the police with the active knowledge and support of the British state. And those abuses have...
She came to my school, Tulse Hill Secondary School, and gave a talk. And I think that's what made me curious about the Black Panthers, and I started going to their meetings and asking questions and so on. And I thought, well, I want to be a part of this movement.
Rather than operate in secret, the British Black Panthers would speak out and open themselves up to the grassroots, focusing on the needs of the community as they saw them. To educate the youth through Saturday schools and supplementary learning, to fight racism at the state level, at the street level.
Why, when a Jamaican or a West Indian is picked up, why should he be beaten in the police station?
In housing, in employment, and for the first time, use the law to stand up to the police.
One will have to unite the experience of brutality not only with the police, but brutality in housing, brutality in education, brutality in all areas of our social lives.
Darkest how?
Unite those experiences in ourselves, and that unity must be reflected in our organization.
I thought this is the kind of organization I want to belong to. Serve your apprenticeship, distribute leaflets, sell the newspaper, come to education meetings, and soon one got into it.
My activities included going from door to door to try and get people interested in the organization. Saturday mornings I would be either in Brixton Market
on a Saturday morning,
Balham Market or Croydon Market.
But West Indians mostly are still at the bottom of the economic ladder.
Selling our newspaper, the Black Panther paper.
But now a new wave of youngsters is coming forward.
We had direct links with the American Black Panthers. We used to sell their papers too.
The American pattern of black protest is finding its imitators. At weekends, Black Panther badges are proudly worn on the streets of London.
The Black Panther movement began with the Linton generation coming out of school, and it was the first mass sign of disaffected youth.
Our parents were more like Martin Luther King followers. We were more like Malcolm X followers. Fire for fire and blood for blood, you know.
They knew that they were as intelligent as they were, knew that we could eat fish and chips with the same ease as they did, and came out and found all kinds of discriminatory practices.
And you were Asians as well as
Asians as well as Caribbeans, yeah. But less Asians than Caribbeans. The Asians who came into it were young intellectuals.
We were going to appeal to West Indians, to Asians to join, to Africans, and even Chinese immigrants, of which there were a few in the Black Panther movement. The word black wasn't a skin color. Our slogan was black is a political color.
Black is a political color, or what people today call political blackness. It's the idea that the very fact of not being white is enough to build a multiracial coalition in Britain under the single identifying term, black. It was a definition that suited the Panthers back then. Today, it's a much more controversial idea, too blunt an instrument, too all-encompassing. It's particularly difficult for a younger generation who claim an identity of blackness in Britain that's tied directly to their African ancestry. So in the British Black Panther movement, they define blackness very broadly. So basically everybody who wasn't white, who was a victim of racism, came under this umbrella of black. How do you think that would play out, or does play out today?
I personally have no time for it.
Alia Hissina is a writer and curator.
I feel like it's the same as BAME, as a term that homogenizes groups and doesn't look at the complexity or the different challenges that we face. It actually does a disservice to acknowledging that nuance and that complexity and that humanity. For so many black people, blackness is very different, but black people have never been afforded the idea of blackness being multiplicitous.
I think it's really important when we talk about the word black to include in that time period, location and community. So if we jump back to the late 60s, early 70s, most migrants felt under the same pressure and united under the term black because of numbers.
Michael Riley was a founder member of the roots reggae band Steel Pulse and runs the Bass Culture Project.
It was a numbers game, and you're not powerful on your own as a group or one community. Let's come together under this heading, black. But we're not African Americans. At this point, we're still growing up, if you like, politically. At this point, we're still fighting to identify our own narrative as to who we are, what we are in a place that's saying, go home.
The British Black Panthers were the children of the Windrush generation. Those migrants who had come to Britain after World War II from the Caribbean. Historian David Olusoga.
The generation who were born in Britain, who were the children of the Windrush pioneers, the children of the people who got off boats and planes and formed a community in Britain.
London is a city of change and contrast.
Were profoundly different from their parents, and the most significant difference was that they weren't immigrants, and they lacked the sense of having another place to call home. They didn't tolerate what their parents tolerated.
Well, we believe in preventing the evils which must result from coloured immigration by removing the problem completely.
An angry crowd of youths chases a Negro into a greengrocer's shop.
They had a distant relationship through their parents with the islands their parents had come from, but for most of them it is not a place they'd ever been.
The children are often the main reason for a West Indian's immigration. My child, he says, must have a better education than me.
So they didn't have this sense of being an immigrant. They didn't have that transactional relationship to Britain because it was their only home. It was the only country they knew. And yet they lived at a time and in a place where they were constantly rejected and had their Britishness questioned.
In fact, my parents and all our parents were told that we would be given equal chances to work with white and do the jobs that the white were doing. And what are we doing now?
All around, if you go into places, social places, and people would look at you and be hostile to you, or you could just feel the hostility.
88% of Slough people say they support Enoch Powell.
I was very, very conscious of the hostility and the unkindness that was being meted out to black people at that time.
Leela Hassan Howe would join another black power group, the Black Unity and Freedom Party, and work closely with the British Black Panthers.
Of the future growth of the immigrant-descended population.
I walked past Enoch Powell's march of the dockers who were opposed to immigration. I was on the road and I could see them coming towards me shouting, "Blacks go back." I just remember white men marching and people saying, "Oh, that's because we don't want those people in our country."
Many of us grew up with a split identity. We're struggling to come to terms with the fact that we're Jamaican at home, British on the street, and somewhere in the middle in our heads. We're constantly code switching, or be that accent, what we say, how we say it, who we say it to, manners, everything. It's a very complicated period for us. Simultaneously, we have our parents who abide by the state. The state is right. If you're being stopped by the police, you must have done something wrong. We're growing up with a different attitude. We're British. This is our country, and we're somehow not equal. How does that work?
When bands of armed people with loaded weapons can move about our streets intimidating and frightening citizens, I think we should act, and we intend to act.
You have no right to take my gun away from me. You don't know the Constitution, right?
The American Black Panther Party was committed to armed struggle, a point of huge controversy for both black and white people. This was not the case in the UK, but the British Panthers were disciplined.
We're gonna send the blacks back, we're gonna send the blacks back.
A central core based in London, a printing press, a newspaper, Freedom News, the Black People's News Service, communications joining groups city to city.
Our presence was greater than our membership. We had lots of Black Power organizations, not just here in London, where the Panthers were based, but in Nottingham, in Bristol, in Manchester.
Birmingham, Bradford, there were other branches of the Black Panther movement, loosely associated because there wasn't a written constitution which said they must obey this or that. It would just be contact.
You might not have more than 100 people as signed up member in a particular branch of the Panthers, but the support, the people you could mobilize would be 10 times that.
We weren't into armed struggle. There's a big difference between us and America. We weren't picking up guns. Ours was ideas, words. I would be outside Shepherd's Bush Market selling 100 black voices. You know, we had our quota. We had to sell 100. And you would engage people, you talk to people. So ours was much more a battle of ideas, I think, than of actually we are going to pick up some guns and go and shoot somebody.
The process of seeing paintings or seeing anything else is less spontaneous and natural than we tend to believe.
John Berger, a writer who'd written a lovely book on art, Ways of Seeing it was. He didn't know any of us, but he announced if he won the Booker Prize for a book called G, it was one of the first Booker Prizes to be given out. He said if he won that prize, it was £5,000, he'd give half of the money to the Black Panther movement, and they could do what they wanted with the money.
John Berger, this evening you will be handed £5,000 as a prize for this book. What are you going to do with the money?
The prize is given by bookers who have extensive trading interests in the Caribbean. The extreme poverty is the direct consequence of the exploitation of companies like Booker's and others. And so I intend, as a revolutionary writer, to share this prize with people who are involved in a struggle to resist such exploitation. I'm actually going to give half the prize to the London-based Black Panther movement.
The Panther movement heard about this, and Darkus and I went to the Great Portland Street pub by appointment, and Berger did win. He walked in with his £5,000 in his pocket and sat down with us, had a pint, and signed over £2,500. We bought a house, and that became the North London headquarters of the Black Panther movement.
Black Power in Britain, and the Panther movement especially, had the attention of the police. On one level, this was part of an ongoing confrontation on the streets. There were the hated SOS laws. SOS from suspected person. The precursor to today's stop and search, against which the Panthers campaigned unsuccessfully.
It is imperative from a general preventive point of view that any offender who is seen in such circumstances that he is a suspected person loitering with intent to commit this type of crime should be arrested before he does it rather than afterwards.
The Black Panthers, all the Black Power groups, a major preoccupation of them was the oppression of the police. Black boys in particular being beaten up. I mean, the police just had a field day at that time on the children of the immigrants to this country.
But concerns about Black Power went higher up the force than policing on the streets. And what are these? These are documents from... Visiting the National Archive in Kew, I was surprised at the extent of police surveillance of the Panthers. Pieces here which are redacted, authorised from the highest levels of the British state.
9 times out of 10 been able to force them to declassify at least.
Historians Robin Bonce and Paul Field requested a number of files dealing with the surveillance of the Panthers and other groups under the Freedom of Information Act, and discovered proof that Special Branch had its own dedicated Black Power desk.
So we got Joint Intelligence Committee reports, MI5 reports, reports from the very top of government, Law Office reports, all of this through the Freedom of Information request.
I mean, one of the things that leaked out as I was just skimming through one of the Special Branch reports is there's a list of organisations that was obviously therefore on the police radar. They include the Enfield Communist Party and the Goldsmiths Socialist Society. which I imagine wasn't really a major organisation at any point. And it just shows it's part of the level of state surveillance. Was the state overreacting partly because of the American influence?
I think in the early period they are seriously overreacting, and there was a strategy by the state to try and squash this movement before it really takes off.
Special Branch had teams which kept under surveillance Marxists, and they had various different teams looking for Marxists. So some were particularly keeping an eye on Trotskyites, for example. They had a Black Power desk. The Black Power desk was based in New Scotland Yard. It was based on the very top floor. We believe they had 6 members of that Black Power desk at its height. And in the early days, as far as we can tell, they were able to infiltrate the organisation. They kept a huge amount of detail on what was going on. They had particular files on each of the main players in the Black Power movement. So they were doing a very good job.
What's interesting is when you read the file notes on each of the individuals, you've got comments like in respect to Althea, it says, LeCointe is regarded as one of the brains behind the Black Panther movement and has been described as academically brilliant. She is an excellent speaker and a very militant.
That since we've come here, we've suffered a long train of abuses by the police with the active knowledge and support of the British
Dark as
state.
Howe is regarded as one of the leading black militants in London.
The object of the demonstration was to visit every single police station in the area.
He is a writer of black extremist literature and has taken part in many Black Power activities. He is prominent in the affairs of the Black Panther movement. He and his common law wife, Barbara Bees, are closely associated with Vanessa Redgrave, a benefactress of the Black Panthers.
In the same top secret document listing the key players in British Black Power, we come across Roy Saw.
Anything that is not European does not have any sign of resemblance of contributing anything to the human race.
Who was born in Guyana and is described as an ebullient orator at Speaker's Corner, Hyde Park.
When I talk about white people, I am talking about the white Western society.
Saw has been deeply involved in the activities of a number of Black Power organisations for some years.
Against the human race.
He has convictions recorded against him for obstructing police, assault, and under the Race Relations Act of 1965, which is interesting that you would have a Black Power activist who seems to have been convicted under the Race Relations Act.
Are you civilized? You bunch of warmongering barbarians.
The Race Relations Act of 1965 was designed in such a way that there was no distinction between any kind of racist comment. So if a white person made a racist comment, or if a black person was perceived to incite racial hatred against a white person,
because you got bombs, you got guns, but we are getting guns today.
There was no distinction in the law. This was all equal as far as the lawmakers were concerned.
We do not advocate the killing of white people, but if kill we made to defend our rights, we shall kill you.
Consequently, in 1967, it's used for the very first time against a black radical. And in fact, Roy Saw is the person in British history who was convicted the most times under the Race Relations Act.
I'm just looking through who else is in it. I'm just interested. Iconography was key to the American Black Panther Party. Often pictured carrying guns, in drill formation, wearing shades and black leather. Imposing images partly designed to scare white America. But the party also had another side.
Come on in, little sister. Y'all can sit down and get something to eat.
The majority of Panther work involved running outreach programs city to city.
And we putting these programs out for the people, digging?
Feeding school children and providing medical care, often within the poorest sections of the community.
Come to the clinic tomorrow for an appointment.
Does it feel painful? No, it's not painful. Like it's infected and everything?
Here in Britain, with its welfare state, the Panthers were more heavily involved in community education. With so many black children failing at school, teachers complained about not understanding the Jamaican accent. The term used was educationally subnormal. The Saturday schools were key.
I think the whole point is that the British school, in fact, does negate the personality of black children, and it doesn't do so accidentally, that it actually sets out to remove any feature that might threaten the society.
Because I was a teacher, I think they were interested because I had something very specific to offer. I could teach in the Saturday school as well, which is what I did.
Beverly Bryan was a British Panther who helped run the Saturday schools.
I saw myself being involved in community defense. A kind of curriculum that would allow children, if you had a lot of black content in the curriculum, that was one way in which you're defending them against racism, talking about black this and you black that. Having experienced that myself, that was something as a teacher. I wanted to help the children to know you're not that. You come from somewhere much greater than that.
Growing up in the 80s and 90s in Birmingham, this tradition of community education had a huge impact on me. My dad taught in Saturday schools, and I was volunteered to work in the Harriet Tubman bookshop in Handsworth as a kid. Books were everything. That was the first one I read.
Did you take the cover off?
I fell off. I also went to Saturday school, along with so many other kids of my generation, and ended up teaching in one.
Kehinde Andrews. I worked for the Race Relations Board and Kai's mum.
I was going to ask how important were the books, because I remember these being really important to me growing up, but how important were they at the time?
Obviously, what was happening in the States, particularly once the Panthers came on the scene, opening schools, bookshops, this was yet another dimension, and there was a lot of activity in the UK and sort of shaped the way that you thought about things from a British perspective, yeah. Looking at this one, Soledad Brother, 1971. This is a book about the prison letters of George Jackson. He was one of the black activists in the States, Black Panthers.
We'd go to these Saturday schools. Sometimes they were in community centres, but most of the time they were just in someone's front room. And a lot of those teachers weren't very highly qualified. You know, they just read the books and they started just reading the books to you sometimes, you know.
The education ran from Caribbean folklore, stories about black children navigating British schools, all the way through to writings by intellectuals such as C.L.R. James.
This sugar plantation was a very severe and demanding mode of labour.
Frantz Fanon and E.P. Thompson.
It is life and the source of life that are being bought and sold that you come through to an entire sense of negation.
There were sought-after American books. George Jackson's Prison Letters, Soledad Brother.
Time seems to be passing much faster these last few months. I wonder where it's running to.
Malcolm X's autobiography.
That freedom comes to us either by ballots or by bullets.
And Angela Davis's If They Come in the Morning.
If people are serious about moving ahead to create a better society, then of course...
There was somebody called J.A. Rogers that just used to write all this stuff about the great kings and queens of Africa and the great mathematicians and astrologers and all this kind of stuff. And it was fascinating, and it really kind of inspired me for a very simple reason, because everybody else was saying that, well, you know, in school our education started with the discovery of black people, as if we didn't exist until we were discovered.
The Black Panther movement used to hold youth education classes in black power and politics. And 100, 200 youths would gather, and they got me to lecture on E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class.
Those ideas were very important to me.
Some serious education that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise.
That was my university. I become confident about myself and my community. I know where I was going. Nothing is impossible.
Judgment has come and mercy has gone.
The Mangrove 9 trial was to be one of the longest in British legal history.
The trial of the Mangrove 9 was a key moment for black power in Britain and for British law.
Constant solidarity.
The Mangrove restaurant was a hub for the Notting Hill black community, a resting place in Babylon, as the writer Ambalavana Shivanandan put it.
The Mangrove was on All Saints Road, and it was known for its good food and its atmosphere, and the fact that it was black-owned, black-run, and that you could go there, that it was a community restaurant.
Its previous incarnation was the Rio, and the Rio was where the Profumo scandal had gestated. And Christine Keeler used to hang around there. There began a regular Notting Hill police harassment of the Mangrove. They would go in there and say, if blacks are gathered here, there's bound to be drugs.
Black people! Black people!
In August 1970, the Panthers organised a demonstration in the Mangrove's defence. The protest itself was fairly modest, around 150 to 200 people. Police numbers were considerably higher, but it became heated.
It has been for some time now
Darcus Howe addressed the crowd.
that black people have been caught up in complaining to police about police.
The march was monitored by the Black Power desk.
You had numbers of inspectors, numbers of chief superintendents, and a whole host of constables lined in military formation. That is what we were presented with.
There were a series of arrests of the Panther leadership and its associates, including Darcus Howe,
Radford Darcus Howe, riot, affray.
Althea Jones-LeCointe,
Althea Jones-LeCointe, riot, affray.
Barbara Bees,
Barbara Bees,
and 6 others.
riot, affray.
The Mangrove Nine.
The Mangrove Nine. 2 women, 7 men, 31 charges.
The defendants were charged with conspiring to start a riot. These charges carried serious sentences. A victory for the prosecution would have finished the Panthers. Ian MacDonald QC organised the legal defence for the Mangrove Nine.
Where you have an organisation which is planting roots in the black community, that is seen as dangerous. And you get that military line of police, they were there to stop it.
The 9 defendants took an unprecedented step. 7 were represented by legal counsel, and it was decided among them that 2 would defend themselves. This gave the 9 vital freedom of political manoeuvre in the court. With their
In a move that captured the imagination of the media, and itself an example of black power in action, Darcus Howe and Althea Jones-LeCointe represented themselves in court. Ian MacDonald synchronised the operation.
Darcus Howe, he'd done bar exams. I said, look, if you're going to be radical in a court, you have to be better versed in the law than your opponent.
See, in this particular case, the judge came with his orders from his masters, which is this.
And he also, of course, was a natural orator and was a very, very good cross-examiner. He really was.
In all cases, and in this case, was no different.
Althea was probably the main leader of the Black Panthers at the time, and she was the kind of person who could read out the alphabet and you'd be transfixed.
They have no interest in the truth. They fight a case to win.
All the other people were part of the Black Panther movement.
To get rid of my barriers.
There was a cohesion.
Like the judge,
the first thing that I did was I made an application for an all-black jury. My client was Barbara Bees.
During the Mangrove trial, very, very early on, we decided to invoke Magna Carta, that we should be entitled to a jury of our peers. And both Darcus Howe and Ian MacDonald took to this idea avidly and spent 2 days arguing before Judge Clark as to why we should have the right to a jury of our peers. And even with 2 days of legal argument, Judge Clark dismissed it out of hand.
I'm Selma James, and I was a witness for Althea Jones, who defended herself. The Mangrove trial was run on the basis of letting the community know what was happening about their future in that courtroom. If the Panthers had lost, they would be in a lot of trouble with police who would feel empowered in what they were doing. And therefore, this case was a test case for all of us.
Having a camera on a demonstration is the most useful thing you could do. The camera is a protection. They were fortunate enough, I was fortunate enough, to photograph that particular place where the police were saying that Darcus was here and he was doing that sort of thing and so forth and so forth. So I had to go to the Old Bailey and I explained to the judge and showed the judge photograph, and the judge accepted my version and not the police.
Radford Darcus Howe, not guilty. Barbara Bees, not guilty. Godfrey Millet.
All 9 were acquitted by the jury of incitement to riot.
Not guilty.
For the first time in British legal history, the justice system acknowledged racism in the police force. Although far from complimentary about the Panthers, in his summing up, the judge explicitly acknowledged the trial had, quote, regrettably shown evidence of racial hatred inside the Metropolitan Police. What do we know about other tactics that the police would have used other than surveillance? So thinking of things like wiretapping and particularly infiltration of the British Black Panther movement.
Well, there's currently an independent judge-led inquiry into surveillance by special branch and groups within special branch of protest organisations, left-wing groups, black organisations, dating from this period right up until Stephen Lawrence's campaign and after. We know, for example, there were people on all these marches, but obviously we don't know names, we don't know who they were, because it's secret. And the documents that we do have, the verbatim reports that we do have in the files, names are redacted.
So what happens to the Black Power Desk after this period?
I think the Black Power Desk becomes subsumed into the general surveillance the Special Branch is undertaking. The Black Power Desk was tasked with decapitating the movement, with collecting the evidence which was going to bring down the Black Panthers, but at the end of the Mangrove campaign, the Black Panthers succeed, the state is trounced. And for that reason, these documents show the Black Power Desk is put under new management. My feeling is it's wound up.
I think it was a Sunday, and they said there's an emergency meeting of the Central Core. So I said, well, I have to go. And we sat in this room, and they said, we've called this meeting for a special purpose.
A young black man, I'm not going to name him, had a white girlfriend. But Black Unity and Freedom Party had something quite similar, where there was this whole thing of people hiding that they had white girlfriends, and whether that meant you had to be kicked out of the movement because of it.
So they brought him down, and he was crying. And I said, look, I can't sit through this. This is a kangaroo court. This is not political activity. You know, people can screw who they like. And I was resisted very strongly, and I walked out.
I can only speak because it happened in Black Unity Freedom Party, is that it turned in on itself. So we started to argue amongst ourselves. We began to have politics like religion. You're wrong, it's right. It all became a big moral question rather than a political question. And I think when politics degenerates into moralism, then you're on a hiding to nothing.
It began the fraying of the Black Panther movement.
The British Black Panther movement had a short life. It largely disbanded by 1973. Some joined other groups or built new coalitions, like the Black Women's Group. A key area of influence will be the media. Former members and associates, Darcus Howe, Farouk Dundee, Linton Kwesi Johnson and Leela Hassan Howe took over the journal Race Today, which ran for 15 years. Farouk Dundee became a commissioning editor for the newly founded Channel 4. Photographer Neil Kenlock went on to found Choice FM, the first black-owned radio station in Britain.
The most important thing that happened in my life is actually to join the British Black Panthers, because they gave me so much confidence. And the Black Panther actually told us about our history, about where we came from. It gave us strength, and it made me what I am.
People say to me, oh, it must have been difficult growing up in the 60s and 70s. I'm telling them, not a minute. It's the one time in my life when I felt in control daily of what I did, why I did it, and who I did it for. And it was a wonderful feeling.
Almost all the problems the British Black Panthers fought against remain today. Black children are still more likely to be excluded from school and less likely to succeed. The Windrush scandal showed a hostile immigration environment to be alive and well. The police remain a source of complaint from black communities, and black and minority ethnic youth represent more than half of the juvenile prison population. To be black is still to be a suspect, still a target. And some of this stuff still some of this stuff isn't on the radar at all. So you were part of the group that organised the 2016 Black Lives Matter protest after the death of Philando Castile was live Facebook streamed across the world. So do you think we need the British Black Panther movement today?
Black power, it can never be one thing. I think it starts with knowing that you are of value. In a country that constantly wants to devalue you, and why is black power always synonymous with aggression? If we're trying to develop spaces of black power, it needs to be a power that celebrates difference, nuance and multiplicity. The beauty in what it means to be black and in Britain, what it means to live and to survive and to thrive. Yeah, I guess we just can't do unto others what was done unto us.
It will be easy to write off the British Black Panther movement as a short-lived and finally failed experiment in trying to make Britain truly embrace its black citizens. But for me, the real legacy of the Panthers is how they changed the debate.
That's the essence of black people's experience in Britain. That since we've come here,
bringing about a new language of defiance and pride, and the education to support it.
We have become the own shepherds of our destiny.
A legacy for future generations to deal with the problems of racism, and maybe, by drawing deep on that generational knowledge, that intellectual history, draw on the spirit of the Panther.
So this is my first Fire in the Booth Part 1. I offer what I think is one of the main solutions, which is study, Education, knowledge is power. So read, stuck on the block. Read, sitting in the box. Read, don't let them say what you can achieve. Because when people are enslaved, one of the first things they do is stop them reading. Because it is well understood that intelligent people will take their freedom. Because if we knew our power, we would understand we can't be held down. If we knew our power, we would not elevate not one of these clowns. If we knew our power, we wouldn't get arrogant when we get 2 pennies. If we knew our power, we would see what everybody sees, that we're rich already.